And thank you all for coming up on a Sunday morning. Means so much. We're going to be talking today about public programming, and I have with me a very distinguished panel here, and also in the institutions that they represent, institutions that go back over a century and more, and those that are younger and are celebrating 15 years, 10 years, and so on. I'm going to start off with a question with you, Roobina. The Kiran Nadar Museum of Art turns 15 this year, and I was at the fabulous show yesterday, and what an incredible footprint you've created over these couple of decades. I do know, however, we're going to start with a quick chat about collections, that the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art has built up a substantive collection over the past 2 decades. Tell us a bit about that.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Deepthi. Thank you all for being here. Yes, it's a 15 years journey, and the KNMA has been growing and still growing its collection into a substantial one, and in many ways a seminal one, which is really taking care of the length and breadth of the artistic practice in India, but it's also extending to really embrace South Asia. So it's a collection that is growing its span in one sense. And if I can add that from the early years to now, the way we are defining ourselves is that our span is becoming much more extensive as we also step back into medieval times and going back to miniature traditions, which is also a collection, while we also are stepping forward. Hence, the opportunity to really do something is unique and great, because it's not so specific anymore to a particular span of time or any particular movement or just a group of artists, but it really allows to look at civilizational breadth in one sense, not fully, but in many ways. And that really changes the dynamics of both curating, exhibiting, and programming. And that has become a very it's a deep engagement in that sense, and a deep commitment that comes from the museum. Since we are a collecting museum, we collect, we are building a collection that we think is very important in this region to represent South Asia as a region.
Thank you. I move over to you, Rein. For you, the collection spans back well over a century. And talk to us about the origins of the Stedelijk Museum, and you've had a refurbishment program recently, and what were your thoughts of how the collection and the physical spaces interact?
Yeah, we as a Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, we are already an old institution. We are almost 150 years old. We are a museum for modern and contemporary art and design. In the Netherlands, design comes also into the art museums. Normally, it's kind of integrated. It's a very Western collection, of course. It's a collection which has some major focus points like Western European art, like Northern American post-war art. We are very strong in that, and then also specifically a lot of attention, a lot of focus on Malevich and Russian constructivists. At the same time, we know that we have to broaden up. We know that we have to broaden our scope. We are broadening since about 10 years now, I would say. Something else maybe, the Stedelijk was one of the first museums for contemporary art in Europe and in the world also, one has to say. It was the second museum which became a white cube museum. That was in 1938 when the director was on leave. The then curator painted a whole lot of walls white in the museum, which meant like the start of the contemporary and the start of contemporary collecting also. So we are still on the track of contemporary collecting, but we need to do it with a broader global scope. And for that, of course, we have special focus on colonial history, which was an important and also black history for the Netherlands. One has to say we are dealing a lot with decolonization in our collecting and exhibition programming. And to come back to your other question, Deepthi, about the refurbishment of the museum, yes, we did have a new wing attached to the museum, which was opened 12 years ago, and which is a considerable antithesis to the old 19th century building we had up till then, and which makes us capable of showing different things in different contexts and in different architectural settings, and which is a chance, because I think history and contemporary is also about antithesis, and you have to show that every now and then.
I think that's a challenge that many of the older institutions face. A lot of the older large museums were in that sense, they had global collections based on the histories of their nations and the collecting methods that were formed. Today, the younger institutions, I think, sit lighter and are more focused on regions and areas. So my next question is for you, Chris. With the Asia-Pacific Triennale, when we spoke, you were telling us about how the collections have been focused on a region, and how you are building collections that are focused in storytelling of peoples that are geographically close to you. Tell us a bit about that.
It's a collection which largely has really formed since the 1950s. But it's a collection which was founded initially 130 years ago, but very eclectic, a strong focus, of course, on Australian art, First Nations art, and a fairly broad brushstroke European historical, modern, contemporary collection, but not really known for anything other than the work that we've collected from the Asia-Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, which was founded in 1993, so it's been going for 11 editions. We opened the 11th edition just late last year in December. And the exhibition has grown over the years through the acquisition of about 1/2 to 60% of the exhibited work that we either commission or borrow and acquire for the project ends up in the collection. So we've got about 1,800 works that really are probably the largest focused collection of contemporary Pacific art anywhere in the world, because there are very few Pacific art-based museums. Some, Vanuatu, Shibao, etc. But there are very few, and we travel extensively through the Pacific. We work with community groups, we enable new work to be made, particularly working with women, because they are the makers for most of the Pacific, not so much in PNG, but in Melanesia, but Polynesia and Micronesia, the women are often the drivers. Right. In fact, we were given a grant by an individual who loved the work we were doing with women in the Pacific, to the extent it now enables us to buy quite a large body of Pacific work by women, textiles, weaving and so on. But also in Asia, we, over the years, have shown the work of 60 countries. This year we've added Uzbekistan, we've added Saudi Arabia and Timor-Leste. And we're now getting to a point that our collection in some areas, like China, Japan, they would be countries where we would have possibly the best contemporary holdings outside those countries.
Do the countries?
And we've been told that by curators and directors from those areas. So it's a really strong collection with a kind of particular, as you say, regional take. And we're taking a component of that collection from the 90s to now to the V&A Museum next year, the first time it's been seen outside Europe, outside Australia. So very excited about where it's all headed.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I speak to institutions that have collections are at the core of public programming, in many ways, the first three panelists spoke about how a collection is the foundation on which the public programming rests. Now I'm going to move on to Smriti here and then to you. Serendipity, Smriti here, my friend, India's best loved festival turns 10 this year. It seems like yesterday that it began, but at the heart of the Serendipity's programming, your model is that you don't really have a collection that belongs to the foundation. So talk to me a little bit about how the programming is as vibrant perhaps as that of a museum, but it's for a shorter period, it's a festival, and it sits on the public infrastructure of a city.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel with these eminent colleagues. The foundation was started as a grant-giving body. The intention was never to collect. And as we started giving grants and we did some projects, we realized that to bring about a cultural movement in the country, we needed something of scale. And that scale came with the idea of festivals because it adapted to the behavior patterns of the country. We're a country of festivals. And so how do you kind of integrate culture within what exists? It was really interesting because for us, our museum was the city of Panjim, which rests in Goa. And we wanted to see how culture kind of wove through the city, through events, time, space. And the intention was never to acquire art. I mean, there are many reasons why we didn't do that, but we were built out to be an agile foundation. And we wanted to question status quo on what museums did. We were not a museum, we were a temporary museum that arose for 8 days.
So, just to interrupt you, when you say an agile museum, was it conscious that you don't have a geographic grounding in terms of a physical building?
Yes, we didn't want the context to take over the intent that we had, which was to question why we did what we did as cultural institutions. There is an inherent failure of cultural institutions in the country. We all know about it. And so where are we really going wrong? So the festival was started as an experiment to see what works with a large demographic. I still remember the first year when we started the festival, we were asked, who's your target audience? And we did not want to define that. And that really set tonality for what we wanted to do. Through the festival, we give out production grants, we give commissions, but those works never belong to us. The only thing we ask of the artist is to mention that it was commissioned by us. They're free to sell the works, show the works, which I feel also then gives them an opportunity to take the work beyond us quite immediately. And it's not only on our responsibility to show the work again, to show what the practice is becoming. Now over 10 years, we're going to turn 10. We never thought we would get here, but we consider ourselves an incubation center where we give a certain amount of seed for the artist to develop their artistic practice, to engage with a large audience and not just the audience of specific closed-door museums, to see how they respond and develop practice from that.
I think for museums, that word is quite scary these days when you say closed door, because I think every museum is trying to just do that, open doors to wider audiences and more stakeholders. I bring the next question to you, Andrea. Tell us a little bit about, for the audience here, the Haus der Kunst, and how the programming rests on as a global center for the arts.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you also to the Goethe-Institut who welcomed me very nicely. We are an institution that has the luck to be in a town that is committed to the art. So I arrived during COVID, and the first choice was trying to cooperate immediately with the network institution, or with the other institution, and it became now a network. So that allowed us to generate a path that makes sense for the local public, and makes sense also based on the memory of the local public. So what the public has experienced in the previous 20 years through the previous directorship, the one that came before by Occidental opened the institution globally, particularly focusing on Africa and America. So the shift we started to building on was, on the one hand, towards what are the seeds in town and how the seeds are transforming the life of the town. There is a major IT, let's say, revolution happening in the region, and we wanted to acknowledge it and to build a dialogue with this huge community, which is of the expat communities. On the other hand, there was a lack of everything has to do with performativity, liveness, sound, music, and media. In a building that somehow was known for displaying big paintings and big sculpture, and was opened by Adolf Hitler in person as the main propaganda building. So we went in a totally different direction. But as I said, building on the memory, like dealing with this idea of how those that are now in the 30s, 40s, 50s have experienced the institution in the last decades. The vision is based on interconnecting everything. Like there is never a show isolated. There are always groups of shows. And as I said, sound and music are somehow the spine that drives everything and connects everything. We focused in the last 6-9 months on particularly on digital culture and the idea of language and how language is changing and transforming. We are switching towards the summer into the very young generations. By this I mean one scope was to bring audiences back to the institution and to engage with them, and mostly we wanted to do it with the young and very young to build a future. So perhaps the most, say, interesting step is that we are working starting on a group show that was titled is For Children. This is a quote of a work of Bruce Nauman, but in fact the idea was to look at the arts of the last 50 years that was explicitly made for children, and therefore becoming global, because looking at the differences between what is made in Latin America, what is made in India, what is made in the Western world, and we're working on that. But as I said, it's connected to other programs that are somehow farming since a while.
You mentioned liveness. Can you explain that for me? Because that's something that you repeat. So explain liveness, because I don't think that is something we have here.
Liveness we intend in two ways. On the one hand, the idea of an institution where everything is always going on and there's always a lively feeling, so everyone entering could feel, hopefully, being part of a lively community, an ongoing. On the other hand, the program is really based on liveness in the sense that what we display, we do not ship, almost, we produce. We tend to display, present throughout our exhibitions, works that are driving more the bodily perception than what goes through the reading, right? So like really feeling and experiencing and learning from important writers and thinkers of the last years, like thinking our bodies more like the bodies of an octopus rather than a body with a brain here. That's the thing. And of course, so much liveness, meaning performativity and music and sound, but seen from the perspective of the arts.
That really, I mean, it strikes home. I'll take that across to you, Chris, you as an educator and a curator. This is in other words, and we can use the word of inclusivity and accessibility, but that's also at the heart of how you do your programming, of bringing people in and making them feel alive.
Yeah, I've got a nice kind of link in a way, because in 1999, in the third triennial, we introduced a kids triennial, and it was specifically designed working with artists, always artist-led, never our team leading. And one of the first projects we did, we must have chosen well, this was a long time ago, but it was a Kusama project, because we'd worked with Kusama before, and she made it work for us called the Obliteration Room, which has been seen by 5 or maybe even 6 million people globally. Right. And we effectively own the license to recreate the work. The Tate did it in the Turbine Hall to great acclaim 2 years ago. And then we also, going up to the present day, Rithika Merchant, a wonderful artist from here, we've got a series of 5 big watercolours by her in the current show, which are breathtaking. We've made them, in fact, our sort of media promotional poster. She worked with a group of children in the exhibition space right in front of her work, getting them to work with a clay to make objects that were gifts from their future. So they had already time travelled out to the future, found these objects and brought them home. And we did that in the gallery space in front of the work, with the artists leading the workshops. And then we've got other projects, there's probably about 6 other children's art projects And Rithika, again, because she got a lot of focus in this current exhibition, there was a screen that was produced by our digital team, probably, I don't know, 6 meters across. And what we did was took one of her paintings, rendered it digitally, again, all with her cooperation. And then kids could pick up a small little object which was in the shape of one of the symbols or motifs in the painting and move it around. And as they moved it into the landscape, something that was a bird man took on wings and flew away. I mean, it was so full of charming, beautiful things.
Rithika's galleries are actually here. Tarka's, when you see the fair later, Rithika's galleries are here. In fact, in her latest collaboration with Dior, she actually works with the Chanakya School of Art, who are also here. And together they've brought to life the wonder that I think her art brings forth.
So, just in
an
response,
amazing way.
pardon me, Deepthi, just in response to your general observation about accessibility, we particularly take language seriously. And in the most recent exhibition, which is on now, we've translated every caption into the language of its maker. Every single caption.
Wow.
We've never done it so comprehensively. And we also, when artists are doing talks, if they're from Cambodia or Myanmar or Thailand, we'll have them being translated directly rather than doing their best in English if they don't have a strong grasp of English. We also do a lot of the normal things that we all do around accessibility, low sensory viewing for kids on the autism spectrum. We work with particularly local diaspora who also help us create works, like artists making a work collaboratively at a community level in Samoa, a group of local Samoan young people and their elders assisted to make the fale or the hut that the Samoan artworks were installed in. So we're really interested in getting our local community to participate, particularly if they come from outside Australia, they're an immigrant or diaspora community. That opens the exhibition up unbelievably to
Absolutely.
a far
Because
more diverse
these are
audience.
windows, I think, that were, and I think you would agree, that were not known even a decade and a half ago. In India now, with the newer institutions, accessibility, inclusivity, and including even neurodiverse audiences, stakeholders is very, very important. In fact, next door to us in the next Black Cube is a lovely inclusion lab run by Access for All. I don't know if they are here. Access for All, and they also underline a lot of the programming that both Roobina, you do, as well as Smriti. Also, Serendipity has been inclusive from the very beginning. They invite audiences to come, touch, play. Play is so important in understanding objects that are sometimes quite complicated. And they also, what you just said, bring in people who perhaps cannot read an English label or for that a Hindi label. In India here, I don't know if we can ever get into all the languages. Roobina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting what we are listening, because it's important to think, and we have been thinking about, I think it's very important to keep defining yourself as a museum, that you are not just a repository of objects, neither just a site of display, but you are that place where conversations can happen, conflicts can happen, what you talked about, liveliness in terms of how you can open up the exhibition. And I'm a strong believer in, you can have the greatest building on earth, you can have the greatest collection, but if you do not have a robust, inclusive and innovative programming around things, you will not be able to populate the museum. And not just populate, as a museum which is not a festival, you have to think about sustained audiences that keep coming back to you. So the relevance of a museum is extremely important to put forth and really think about. And I think the possibility that I was mentioning earlier, that you could actually think about the span that in the way that KNMA is functioning and collecting is about also intergenerational artistic voices, bringing artists and communities together, but also about the historic and contemporary, as Rein spoke about, can be juxtaposed or can be experienced. And these forms of engagement and experience that all of us are talking about are extremely important, because our audiences are neither monolith neither one type. We do not want one type of audience.
Everyone speaks 3 languages.
Absolutely, and imagine, even as a museum person who has to think in how many languages should I translate my text labels, should it just be the national language and English, or should I go regional in terms of if I'm showing in Calcutta, do I have a 3rd language included, that is Bengali, or if I go to Chennai, what would be the language that I would include? These are all forms of inclusivity, in ways that you would think how you want to reach out to audiences, because the users and the viewers are at the center of the museum in one sense. But accessibility is one thing I want to just briefly mention, because we have had a lot of thinking and rethinking about it. Because most times we feel if we have made the museum wheelchair accessible, we have become an accessible museum. But that's not really how a museum becomes accessible. I think disability that we put, brails and we put many other things is a natural part of human condition. It happens. But I think more important is we have to pay attention on not being discriminating, not really, creating barriers. Those barriers are even worse. That disability that people feel that they cannot belong or be in the museum, is worse. So this cognitive kind of, belonging and accessibility is extremely important for a museum when it comes to thinking about inclusivity or how to make this museum accessible. And in India, the challenge is huge, because we are a country of multiple tongues and multiple castes, creeds, religions, languages. We are already a diverse culture, a diverse nation. But how do you bring that and how do you address that in the context, into the context of a museum?
We were working on a currency museum, and for the 3 of you, our currency notes in India have close to 12 languages.
Yes.
Our very currency, we have the denomination written in, I think, 9 languages. Now, of course, we all do digital money, so nobody is looking at currency notes anymore.
I think the change in both tangible and intangible behaviors is very important for the museum.
Smriti, as someone where the whole city comes to you, what are your thoughts? I mean, you've had some real experiences and improved on them from year to year. Talk to us about that.
When we started the festival in the first year, we were doing a festival for the city. So there was no barrier. Everyone could reclaim their public space. The venues we used belonged to the public, which the government was using as offices. Then they emptied them out, and we were like, hey, how do you reclaim public space? And so hence culture became a medium for us. Every year, we've learned with the new audiences that walk in. We've learned with their requirement. I'm very proud to say that we didn't want to go down the checklist route. Obviously, the government set out some mandates on how to make things accessible. What does inclusivity mean? What does neurodiverse mean? But for us, success is that everyone who walks into the festival feels like they own the festival and they can access it with no barriers, which means our text sometimes, when our curators give us text, is downplayed, so it's easier to understand. It's great to have academic might behind it, but it's also, if you want to build new audiences, you need to connect with them. So we kind of looked at various levels of accessibility. It wasn't a choice for us. I mean, the whole city is our stakeholder. So when we make our stakeholder map, our first stakeholder is the city. So it's every citizen of the state, everyone traveling in. So how do you really make them feel at home? Last year, while we worked with Access for All in Siddhant, since we started, we've done audits for the city. We've commissioned ramps for the city because the city was our stage and we had to make it accessible. But last year we decided that we needed to see it from a different point of view. We got a curator for accessibility. His name is Salil Chaturvedi. He's a photographer and a reporter. And we asked him what his perspective was, which was beyond the checkboxes of saying we'll have ramps and braille, like Roobina was saying very rightly, that it's not about just the checkboxes. Those are now hygiene points. It's how do you go beyond that? And how do you make everyone from any economic background or caste or creed or religion, the diversity of India, everyone feel at home? I think one of the successes is because the festival is free, you can't really distinguish and everyone can walk in.
And in many ways, these festivals and interventions that culture presents as bridges, as standalone events, art fairs, festivals, museum shows, have shown the way to our state authorities, central authorities, and how it can be done. Audits are done, you don't have to, it can seem very daunting to make an entire city inclusive, accessible, just in terms of infrastructure. But these small outlays, they're not so small actually. Your venues sometimes go up to 8, 9 venues. 22, I stand corrected. 22, if you can do 22 venues, surely you can do half the city. So that's how it takes. At the Stedelijk, you started I think you did an introspection program, and then you started a program that was known as White Balls on Walls, is it? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, we didn't start a program called White Balls on Walls, but there was a documentary made on our inclusivity program, and the documentary maker called the documentary White Balls on Walls, which was, I think, was a good title at the end. But to come back to accessibility and inclusivity, it's two completely different things, I would say. And we have to be careful that we don't think that accessibility is about making things easy. Because that's what's happening also. I'm not speaking about all of you, but I'm speaking about others in the cultural field. We have a villa next door, for instance, which writes museum on its door, and they only have 10 artists, and it's 10 different editions of the artists, and it's about Banksy, about Warhol, and about Koons, and about nobody else, and they end up being very accessible, and they end up being very successful also, because easiness is the key to economic success these days. And we as institutions, we have to be careful that when we want to become more accessible, when we want to become more inclusive, that we keep a good level of being speaking about what we are doing. We start with the content. When I started at the Stedelijk a bit more than 5 years ago, I started to work at an institution which had a long tradition of being artist-driven. And being artist-driven means that you listen to the artist and that you speak to the artist, and that the artist is a starting point for an exhibition and for programming. And when we redefined this, we said we want to be artist-driven, but we also want to be, and we need to be audience-driven these days, and we also need to be context-driven. We need to see what's happening around us. We need to put it in the context of society. And all these 3 different things, being audience-driven, artist-driven, and context-driven, are 3 different sides of the story. And we always we always have to think about all 3 of them when we start up something new. And it's difficult. When I want to make a text about an exhibition more accessible, then I have to fight with a lot of artists to be able to get it more accessible. And the neighbor can get it accessible from the start because he doesn't care about artists. He doesn't care about whom he's working with. And at the end, he also doesn't care about his audience because he cares about economic success and about accessibility on being easy. So we have to be careful. We have to take into account that we are there for everybody, basically, that we want to be a mirror of society on the one hand, but this is not an easy thing. This costs also a lot of money and takes means away from building up an easy and successful program. Successful means broad, means being there for everybody, and means being accessible. At the same time, it starts with the art. It starts with the artist, and it starts with what is necessary in terms of contents and in terms of relevance.
I'm so glad you bring up the point when you say it's not easy. And those few words mean a lot to us here, because as we as a country discover the ways of public programming in the arts and cultural spaces, this is an awareness I think as professionals realize profoundly, that it is not easy. We have to hold hands, and there have to be people who have to distill and look at the perspectives of how we are able to contextualize really a large body of work. You were telling us that you run the entire festival with barely 32 people, which is incredible. Yeah, and do you feel challenges because of that?
Well, not really. It depends on, I mean, we've been lucky to have a fabulous team that has passion. We do expand on ground. We have many agencies. We have our curator sitting in the back. They can tell you how small the team is and the struggles that they face. But it keeps it tight. It keeps the passion going. It keeps the vision intact. Then the vision doesn't get diluted, and that's a contrast to. And we will have to grow eventually, given our future plans. But we are also trying to figure out what is the right model for cultural institutions, where the vision and the intention remains with each member working in the organization.
I think facing the public. Andrea, you work at the forefront of what I imagine as between contemporary art. Even at the fair when I walk around, I see in my head trying to classify, and it's very difficult. I don't know what contemporary art means very well. There is a lovely Subodh Gupta sculpture with a kind of a video art being projected on it. Is it video art? Is it a sculpture? And so on. As artists and creators, and that this is their right, increasingly blur the lines between what our formal classifications of art are. What do you think is the approach that public programming should take? And you've done it in ways of bringing people in.
Well, it's a big question.
Yeah.
A very important question.
Everyone can have a go at it.
I think in our mission of respecting where we are and what do we belong to, which is art history, we are all, I guess, committed to acknowledge histories and to acknowledge, let's say, provenances, and also the time zones. So, what form that perhaps emerged with strength in a region has been already processed in another part of the world, maybe 25 years ago, but a completely different take. So, to me, for instance, speaking about video art, it's very bizarre. I don't use this terminology at all because it was never even been used by the pioneers. Pioneers already a complicated word. In the late 60s, early 70s in the US, they considered themselves artists. But that is where we have to be very rigorous. Like when we speak about experimental cinema, we know where it comes from, what impact it had in this country, for instance, who were the protagonists, and how these protagonists moved. Like take Nalini Madani as an example, from that knowledge and that specific journey into the space of something perhaps they would call installation, but wasn't really an installation because the terminology here didn't make sense. So all that to say that acknowledging the diversity of the dictionaries and the repertoire is the biggest task we have, and never banalizing. It's fundamental. And then we are lucky because, in our case, we are lucky because there is in our case, in Germany and particularly in Munich, there is an extraordinary tradition of thinkers. For instance, Harun Farocki, whose work has inspired this entire research on art made for children. And through that path, we can highlight their research and his own research, but also his specific take on media. So we looking at this figure, these moments that were so groundbreaking and game-changing, you can also get a read of the category that are boxes, but nevertheless acknowledging the fundamental value, which is innovation in the art, or transformation or push forward. So that's a little what we try to do, to put everything on the same level, regardless if the artist is like a obscure Taiwanese, unrecognized yet former experimental filmmaker of the 70s with strong, let's say, engagement in LGBT causes like Shuli Chang. We opened the show in 3 days. Or it's Philippe Parrainot, to make a completely different example. So.
Roobina, I want you to
add to this. What Rein was saying, about. So it's interesting. It's not easy. Absolutely, it's not easy. We learned this lesson the hardest way, I would say, since we didn't start with a independent museum building and we operate in a mall. Okay, the first thing at KNMA that we face is how do we survive against all forms of entertainment which are next door. There's a cinema hall, there is shopping mall, there's everything there, okay? And we are right there next to them. And so we have to, how do we create forms of engagement, okay, where we don't have to dumb down anything, because that's not the purpose at all. Relevance and context and meaning, everything is so important. But equally, if we find that we are presenting exhibitions which people find so opaque, the writings are so obscure, how do we find the middle path is very important. We do want to believe that as a museum, we are the bridge between art and audiences. And if we are the bridge, we need to mediate in ways that we don't drive away audiences, but we cultivate them. We bring them in. We tell our stories. And I found that human interaction and really helps. Because it's not just reading digital screens and just looking at what you put in text, but if you're there to tell some story, to connect artists and audiences, to bring artists to do workshops, to really take on the idea of having conversations, you really open it up well for them. And it has taken us a time. It's taken us many years before people started. They would come with shopping bags and they would come in and ask, what can I buy here? And I said, sorry, you will have a takeaway, but it's not going to be buying because there is nothing to buy here. This is a non-commercial, non-profit, but it's something that you will nourish yourself. And it is nourishing. Nourishment for soul, maybe nourishment for what you find, or the stories that you connect with, and the echoes of life, human life. But it took us time to do this, and I think it's extremely important to make this point, because yes, museums are always under pressure of footfalls, always under pressure to perform, always under pressure to now explain. You use this budget. How did you use it? Explain, what did you do? What is your gain? All this is part of this. And yet, you have to be able to say, yes, I've been doing my job pretty okay. I'm learning and growing and also making mistakes. But I'm understanding what is this that I have to do as a museum so that I'm not something else.
I think you've been doing a stellar job, not just okay. Chris, we spoke about interconnectedness and some of the commissions that you've been able to be behind, on top of, and in front of. Tell us a bit about that.
I'm happy to do that, but I want to sort of, your bridge theme, it's a good one. And I'm absolutely committed to the idea of artist-led, but I'm equally committed to audience responsiveness. Not audience-led, but audience responsiveness. You've got to meet audiences in the many diverse places they live and they come from. And I'd add another thing, and that's cultural context dependent. And particularly when we work with First Nations communities from very, very remote parts of the Pacific and Micronesia and maybe PNG on the other side, we always allow for the fact that we're representing their cultural production, because we're an exhibition, or the Asia Pacific Triennial is an exhibition which has customary practice, traditional practice, people would describe it as. Formerly, people would have described it as craft arts of one kind or another. But we like to think of it as just simply the continuity of customary practices given a contemporary dimension because of their making now. But even though all of them refer back to historical precedents. So to your point, with a country like PNG and Bougainville, we did a project a number of years ago, and I think it was APT 9, it's called Women's Wealth. We sent the curator, Ruth McDougall, great Pacific art curator, across to Bougainville to work with a group of 20 women. We invited weavers from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also weavers from Australia, First Nations weavers, in this case a wonderful master of the medium called Sonia Carmichael, who actually went to the University Museum in Queensland, studied works from her Quandamooka history that did no longer exist and were no longer made with no one with the skill to make them. So she would do the same thing, looking at artifacts in PNG and elsewhere, and teach the women there how to culturally recreate objects from their own past. And that's continued to those same groups of women making those objects today as part of their survival, as things that they can trade and live from. So we really believe that, in countries like that where there is no art ecology, there is no gallery system for distributing work, you have to go to them and you have to collaborate in making work on their terms, not just work for the museum context.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, Smriti, a quick question on public programming and audience responses. From one edition to the other, I do know that does play a part. Because even within the venues that you have in each edition, there are some that have been part of it. You have to go see this, it is so amazing, right? And then you have artist or exhibition responses that are absolutely mind-boggling.
I think when we started the idea of programming a city, we knew that it couldn't be unidirectional, exactly what Roobina said. So every project that we do has many concentric circles. So we start decoding the project. So if there's a project, there's a talk, there are workshops, there could be a takeaway, and that kind of makes it quite large. And that's why Serendipity Arts Festival has taken the scale it has. Just to give you an example, we had 100,000 footfalls a day over 8 days last year. Our venues were full, our workshops were full, and we're an interdisciplinary arts festival. So we have performance, we have music, dance, theatre, culinary arts, and so it has a very large bandwidth. One of the strategies that we took up was that if you are into visual arts, you need to cross something which is something you haven't seen to get to it. So you might come back for the other. So people who haven't heard jazz, they have to walk to a visual arts exhibition, or they have some time, so they see something else, and that's how we've developed our audiences. We actually have 35% repeat audiences every year. We've done 2 impact studies to understand how our programming is actually layering itself with the city and the benefits it gives. I think it's very exciting for us. Last year, we had 220 projects, and like I said, over 350 events over 8 days. And what that does, it gives people the ability to make a choice on what they want to see, because everything is concurrent. So it's also empowering the audience to decide how they want to experience the festival, which has generated very good response for us.
So speak to me about, while we're on it, on the bridge.
Yeah, that's
I'll let them explain, and I'm then going to go around and ask each one of you what the future looks like. Where we are in 2025 is very many blurred ideas. Speak to us about the bridge.
During COVID in 2020 in March, when we were all in lockdown, I went to our founder patron, Mr. Sunil Kankunjal, and we said we can't do a festival. Obviously, we can't have gathering, and maybe we don't know what the future looks like. And he said, let's start building, because we need to look at the brighter side of life and let's build for posterity. And that's when the idea of the bridge came up. It's a new cultural center that we're building in New Delhi. It's going to be housed in Vasant Kunj. It's potpourri of everything we've learned in 10 years. What do audiences mean? How do you design new cultural centers? What status quo are we questioning when we are saying we're building for a city, we're building for a nation? We want to be a pivot for global conversations on everything from ecology to sustainability, but through the lens of culture. How do you get to that? So we're hoping to build something which is aspirational, inspirational, not aspirational. Carbon zero on this day we start, water positive, everything that we wish for a perfect world to be is our ambition right now. Global conversations with local participants and local creative sectors. So let's see how it goes.
Roobina, you have a lot in the coming future, even as you hold together 100 different things on an ongoing basis. Talk to us about public programming and what we can expect from KNMA.
I want to first say that the future is exciting and challenging at the same time, with the new museum building coming up. And as you know, that it's a huge endeavor.
Yeah.
And it's also in some ways a pioneering model, where what we were talking about, interdisciplinary and bringing, integrating multiple forms of knowledge and art forms come together, because it's not just a museum, but it's also going to be a cultural center together. And therefore it would be one place where people would come and spend time, whether it is to see works, whether it's to do programs, listen to music or orchestra or performance and things like that. So it's a huge, huge task ahead, and I'm yeah, I'm not thinking much about it at the moment. We'll cross the bridge when it comes. But certainly the bridge, yes. And when I started as a curator, I always called myself a bridge builder. But anyways, so so the programming is, of course, at the core, as I said earlier, and I think a commitment is to that in terms of how do we make this place more inclusive. And when I say inclusive, it's not just in a token sense, but really to have people come from all over, claim it, own it, belong to it, and be able to find things that programs that really do not really cater to any one kind of audience or one strata of society, but could really be about many things. And I think it's this innovative programming is the key, but also I want to draw your attention on when we work as a museum, there are many more invisible challenges that really don't come to the fore. For instance, we all talked about the shifts and changes in art making that is happening, how artists are really disrupting what was existing before and really bringing in new forms of practices and new forms of art making. And what does that mean to a museum when it has to take care, not care just simply of audiences, but care of the works and their longevity, and their lifespans, and how do you really look after many of these aspects, and you train people, train a team for not just programming, but the task at hand, from collecting, caring, sustaining, and really developing and programming, and many more such things that come together.
Andrea, liveness and connectedness. Do you think that in the time ahead there will be more and more international collaborations?
Yeah, I believe so, absolutely. I believe that we are in an extremely challenging moment, and there is no doubt. Also a major transformational moment, or also reactionary moment in the arts to some extent. And I guess every institution, independent or private, has their own mission to keep connected to the present, imagining the future and never forgetting the past. So in the case of what we do, we try to always highlight a red thread that were not visible perhaps. So not to push so blindly towards the future, or let's say whatever is digital and performative and ephemeral, but always connect, bring it back to someone or somewhere has been pushing these boundaries and maybe having radical postures. I should say often these were women and haven't been listening enough, and then enabling this potential of other history to be seen and to be experienced and to become, let's call them harbors, but also opportunities for the public to generate contents now, and by generating contents, I completely acknowledge what we just said. No, it's not about like being exposed and being involved. It's about being part and through inspiration, bringing that necessity that the arts, or the urgency the arts have, into their own works, professions. No? And this is what I think for us is the most beautiful, not striving for keep doing.
It's
and
early
keep going.
days here, but I think for sure the work that you do when I say the work that you do, all three of you in institutions and countries that have had a head start in being able to publicly program and channel public opinion, as well as fund that into causes and reasons that matter, is definitely something that we can. I have the placard shining up at me, and I will come back to you, but I'm going to quickly take some audience questions as well.
Just one question, and a question, not a comment, not a commentary. Proper
question, yes, please.
Proper question.
Thank you, Charlene.
Thank you. I really appreciated this conversation. And I want to appreciate what Rein Wolfs had said about this tension between, on the one hand, accessibility, on the other hand, the potential of dumbing things down, let's say, or not preserving complexity, right, in that pursuit, and I think there's an analogous kind of tension when we think about inclusion around, on the one hand, and I think the 2024 Venice Biennial kind of highlighted some of these tensions in the sense that when we think about inclusion without actually complicating the very problematic nature of creating canons themselves, we just reproduce and perhaps eliminate the critical nature of that inclusion. Right? So I'm curious as to how any of you might think about that tension, because what we see now is this risk of really sedimenting identities and kind of in a way that doesn't really preserve the critical nature of what inclusion can offer us. So thank you.
No, you're perfectly right about that, I think. It's all a matter of expertise also. And we as museums, we always think that we have a solution for everything. That's what we thought. And we have to know that we don't have solutions for everything. We are slow institutions. Sometimes I'm very jealous when I look at the Kunsthalle like the Haus der Kunst or at the festival, because you can start over new all the time again, and you can allocate your resources to the questions which come up. And we as museums who are accumulating collections, we get more and more, and we are accumulating resources, taking care of collections, and we become, when we don't watch out, we become slower and slower and slower and more connected to what we need to do. And at the same time, we need to solve these questions in terms of inclusivity, in terms of new audiences, in terms of education, in terms of public program, in terms of being live and not only a dead museum. So this is something we really have to think about. When we started our inclusivity program, and we had this documentary made about it, and we saw that documentary 2 years later because they were following us day to day. And then we felt when we saw that, and especially I felt when I saw that we did a lot of things wrong in this, because we did a lot of things, we did it on intuition, and we did it on just doing without having the right expertise, because in a museum you can't find the moment and the time and the resources for using this expertise. So there's a lot of things to do, and we are now in a position that we stepped down a bit, and that we go on the same track, but that we try and find new words for it, a new communication and a new way of working on that. When countries like ours, or the US, or maybe also Germany in the next years, or Italy, or things, have this this extreme right-wing new politics, we have to be careful. When we want to go on with being woke in the good sense of the word, and we want on continuing being woke in that sense of the word, we have to watch out for anti-wokeism, and we have to watch out that we find the right and careful communication on that. And at the same time doing it, and find the expertise somewhere in the organization or outside to be able to do it. Find the resources to do that.
Yeah, that's a lovely answer. I hope that throws some light. Yes, we'll take one more question.
Thank you all so much for this rich discussion. Of course, the goal of inclusivity is to increase the sort of richness. But how do we ensure, whether it's as cultural institutions or even just as artists, culture makers, how do we ensure that the pursuit of inclusivity does not, in fact, lead to things getting watered down or complex to the point that accessibility is completely lost? In other words, how do we teach people and even learn ourselves to embrace complexity when, in a way, we're entering a world where we are finally being called to do this, and we've never done this before. So I'd love to hear from some of you about what your perspective is on how do we embrace complexity and carve that path forward.
I'll Yeah, I can add a line before I hand it over to you. I think that answer, it's a good question, but it's also a very complex question, is that cultural institutions, we're talking about public programming and what makes the DNA of cultural institutions. The very word cultural institution is also very loaded. The institution comes from many factors, such as what is the purpose and mission of an institution? How old is it? How did it come into existence? On these rests the questions that custodians like all of them here today do the important work of programming and taking what they are looking after to the world. And there are inherent, some inherent, I would say, heritage and lineage that you have to deal with in any case. It is a little lighter for younger institutions, but I don't think that they ever, inclusivity or accessibility is ever something that distracts. If anything, it is something that has always to be kept in mind as they go about. So for me, I don't think the watering, we're very far away from that idea of watering what we do. But I'll hand it over to...
I want to quickly add that it's a very important question, and yes, all of us struggle with it. But I think when I said programming, I did not mean at all event.
Exactly.
Just making events, or evening event and morning event. For me, what I have learned through my own journey is it is so much about co-working, co-sharing, collaborating. And if I can say, I realize there is more empathy between museums and institutions, like museums who are speaking with one another across the globe. And that has really helped to think about things like inclusivity or accessibility, or really not doing things in terms of tokenism, okay, just for the sake that, oh, I did not have a vernacular artist, let me put him in this, not at all meaning tokenism, but really, how do we generate these dialogues? How do we think about erasures? How do we think about histories that have come only from one place, or written, discourses that are written in one place? How do we write our discourse? How do we include or make that?
How do we tell our stories, really?
Many different ways.
I think I'll let Chris have a
I
closing
would
note.
just add that I think the way that inclusivity can be a real positive for a museum is when you work directly with the maker and the artist, or in our case often an entire community of 20 or 30 people. And if you work with them in a way that represents their cultural values and their beliefs and the meaning they're trying to communicate through the making of their work. I mean, we work with a group from PNG, from East Tibetan province in Rabaul, where they make these night masks. You may have seen them with sort of duck bills and big eyes. Every museum in the world you visit that you see these exhibited, they're generally inappropriately exhibited by the protocols of those fire ceremonies that they're there to celebrate. I've been to one of those ceremonies. You're only meant to see them by firelight. You're never meant to see them in a museum exhibit case with light blasting on it. So when we presented work from Uramat a couple of last APT, I think APT 10, we actually put these scrims with video of the dance and the ash and the sparks flying everywhere as the boys jumped over the fire. And they just appeared at the end when the lights came up to be shown sort of half through the veil of the performance. That's all the public saw of them. So I think it's about integrity. You need to be consistent. You need to be honest with the way that the maker would have their work best represented. Sometimes you can exceed how they might see it being made because you have a technology or an ability to build a scenography which can amplify that. But I also think honouring cultural protocol with more conventional, customary and traditional work is as important as making great impact with contemporary work.
I think integrity, honor and honesty are three fantastic words to wrap up this panel. As we, as professionals who work in the cultural space, continue to tell stories and program these stories to take it to diverse audiences. Thank you all for coming from all the different parts of the world, braving visa struggles, time zones, and being with us here on the panel. We are absolutely delighted that you're here, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your stay here. A round of applause, please.